Welcome to the Scrappy Entrepreneur podcast, the show that brings you practical, informative tips from the trenches to help you thrive and prosper as an entrepreneur. Whether you're just beginning your journey or working to grow your existing business, this show is for you. And now, your host, the original Scrappy Entrepreneur, Paula Y.
All right. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, I brought together two experienced attorneys to help entrepreneurs and business owners really navigate bringing back employees to work. There's a lot to digest here, and we're going to have all information in the show notes afterwards, so feel free to go there if you need more information. But I'd like to welcome to the show first Deanna Forbush. She is a partner with Fox Rothschild, and Deanna is the regional practice lead for the firm's Labor, Employment, and Business Litigation Department for the Las Vegas office. She has extensive experience handling investigations and administrative proceedings before the EEOC and state agencies, as well as deep experience as it relates to HR business issues. So welcome to the show, Deanna.
Thank you. Great being here.
Yeah. And then we also have Brett Carter on the other side. He is a partner for over 24 years. Well, he's been practicing attorney for over 24 years. Currently, he's a partner for Bertoldo, Baker, Carter, and Smith. And Brett has really dedicated his life to, sticking up for people and individuals. He's a personal injury and wrongful death attorney. And it's really great to have both of them here because we're really going to get both sides of the coin here, talking about what employers can do to protect themselves, but also what's going to happen if Brett comes knocking on our door if we are negligent and an employee gets hurt. So welcome, Brett.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So, Deanna, I want to start with you. What are some of the things that businesses are they responsible for the safety of their employees and customers coming back from this COVID-19?
Well, there's a basic standard that OSHA applies to every employer, irrespective of what industry they're in or how many employees they have. And they essentially charge employers to be responsible for creating a safe and healthy work environment. And I can read you the exact requirement. It says it's the duty of the employer to furnish a place of employment free from hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious injury to harm our employees. So this is an extremely broad standard, and it can mean almost anything. So OSHA hasn't taken the time to say, okay, these are the following things you must do to deal with COVID. They've just said you're responsible. They point to this basic tenet and say you're responsible for creating a safe and healthy work environment.
So what are you advising? How are you advising clients right now?
Well, the thing they have to do is, so the state of Nevada has promulgated or published a roadmap to reopening businesses.
The state of Nevada has?
Yes, which I'm going to give you, and you can post that for your
Perfect.
listeners. And it identifies employers by category. So whether you're in the hospitality industry or you're, bed and breakfast or a hotel or a casino or an office like Brett and I have, there's an actual kind of it's divided into two columns, things that are mandatory requirements and things that are just best practices recommendations. And employers or businesses can look at that and say, okay, these are the things I have to do. I've got to establish some protocols, and that's going to be everybody that works here wears a mask unless they're in their private office and the door's shut, we're going to meet with clients, but we're only going to do it safely distanced, 6 feet away from one another. If somebody says they have symptoms, we're going to do the following things. If somebody calls and said they had a positive test, this is our action plan. And each employer needs to have these protocols written and then follow them.
And is it something that we have to do, businesses have to think about, every time we change our employee handbook, everyone has to sign off on it? Are these written rules that employees should actually sign off on?
I think it's not about it. There's no legal requirement that they do that, but I don't think it's a bad idea.
So it's just about businesses and employers thinking about what kind of plan could I put into place to protect our employees?
Yeah, I think a responsible business should look at the literature that's been, made available from different agencies, whether it's OSHA or the Southern Nevada Health and Safety Department or the state of Nevada, the governor's office. There's a website that has just, an inordinate amount of information. I think everybody's individual lawyers probably have a little, COVID help page like my firm does. If you look at my signature on an email, you'll see, hit this COVID, information page. Everybody's got an information page. So I think, there's lots of information out there of which, I'll give you a lot before I leave today to post. But, they should generally make themselves aware of, recommendations that have been made and then sit down and write their own protocols. This is what Brett did the same thing. He can tell you about it when he was getting ready to open his own office. He gathered information and then they decided what would work for them and they wrote protocols and they follow them. And that's how you steer clear of any kind of discrimination lawsuit is you have rules and you apply them evenly and consistently.
So, Brett, do you want to tell us what you guys looked up before you opened up and brought people back?
Sure. So obviously these are unprecedented times, and you deal with various crises when you're a business owner. This one was a bit unusual. Obviously, you have to educate yourself and decide what's fact versus fear. Unfortunately, in the beginning, as we all know, it was hard to sort of decipher between fact and fear, politics aside. We did reach out to a labor law attorney, Deanna, who's been doing work with us for the years. We do ask her for her guidance, her consult. And I think that's an important piece that a business should have is an attorney who specializes in the area of trying to manage the laws as they relate to their place of business in the state of Nevada. So Deanna's been a tremendous asset.
So can I just say this is key because you are attorneys, but you're hiring a specialized labor law attorney to help you reopen.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way: is if you're a neurosurgeon, but you have diabetes, you're going to be seeing an endocrinologist. If you're a general surgeon and you have a child, you're going to take that child to go see a pediatrician.
Right.
Yeah. So that was one of the things we did. And, so yes, educating ourselves, reaching out to an attorney who specializes in the area, taking the information, drafting it so that it met our business needs, our objectives, definitely erring on the side of safety. Because we are lawyers, we look at what are the legal mandates, what are we required to do? And then you look at ethically, morally, what's the right thing to do? Mm-hmm. And so that was an important piece of it as well.
Deanna, what were the requirements for a law firm?
So it's not a law firm, but an office.
An office, like a professional office.
Right. The governor has required that anybody going back to work wears a mask when they're in a public place. So I think when employees are, as you noticed when you walked in here today, employees walking around in a public space are wearing a mask.
Okay. Customers
that come to the front door are greeted by a receptionist behind a plexiglass. And they're wearing masks and she's wearing a mask. And if they walk in without a mask, she'll ask them to please put on a mask. And then you see in the waiting room, every other chair is turned around so that you can't sit next to one another in the waiting area. And they've made special accommodations for customers that don't want to come into the office. If they're signing documents, somebody might go out to the car and say, okay, sign here and here and here. When people are in their private offices, they don't need to wear a mask. In the kitchen and lunchroom that everyone shares, surfaces are routinely cleaned and sanitized. At the end of the day, I think they do a full clean of the office. And they have other protocols. If somebody says, listen, I have a sore throat today, what should I do? They say, stay home, go get a test, and let me know when you have a clean test. From now, till then, work at home, if to the extent you can, or if you need time off, we'll arrange that too.
So you helped advise a professional office, not just on employees returning, but also keeping customers safe.
Exactly.
And you have to look at both.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else specific did you help them as it related to customers? Like I love that they're offering to be able to sign documents outside of the office, or anything else that we should look at as professional offices as it relates to customers?
Yes, if say a potential customer doesn't want to come, or we call them clients, doesn't want to come into the office, they've arranged Zoom calls, just like we have with our courts.
Okay.
So very few people, unless you're practicing criminal law in justice court, are actually doing in-person hearings at this time. It started to loosen up 8 months later, but in the beginning, there were none. And we're learning how to do those on Blue Jeans or Zoom calls, or in our own private offices, we can arrange to have a video or conference call with employees and customers, or rather clients, rather than have them come in. We're finding out we don't need that face-to-face communication as much.
Right.
We're finding ways around it.
Right. So as business owners and entrepreneurs, we're reaching out to people that can help us put together plans. Tell me, Brett, what are you going to be looking for from an employee's perspective if someone contracts COVID?
So there is an exclusive remedy in Nevada. What that means is you just can't sue your employer if they have workers' comp insurance. So workers' compensation insurance protects the employer from direct liability. So in essence, if you're a business owner, you have workers' comp insurance. Employee gets hurt, so they injure themselves on the job. Your insurance is going to pick it up. Now, if you don't have workers' comp insurance in place, then you don't have those protections. So that means you can be sued directly. And again, there's very few exceptions if you do have workers' comp insurance in place. You would have to essentially almost intentionally try to hurt your employee, like punitive damage, as you sometimes hear. Mm-hmm. So with COVID, it presents an interesting issue. The laws in Nevada do account for exposure to a contagion. Think of tuberculosis.
Okay.
So if somebody gets tuberculosis through the job, it could potentially be covered. It'd be much easier to prove that you got tuberculosis if you worked in a hospital. If you were on the front line and you had close contact with individuals, a firefighter, a police officer, somebody like that. Well, COVID's very similar. So it's obviously it's contagion. It is airborne, aerosolized, and you can get it in a workplace. You can also get it just about anywhere else, sadly. And so there is the laws do seem to favor a worker's ability to prove that it's related to your job and therefore be covered under workers' comp if you're in those fields, medical, firefighter, police officers, first responders. If you're not, you're like all the rest of us, and you come down with COVID, the question is your employer or is your employer's insurance liable for it? You'd have to prove a few things. You'd have to be able to show that it arose out of or that there was a direct causal connection between your employment and you coming down with COVID. It also has to be followed up that it was kind of a natural incident of your work. So it's part of what you normally do that you came into contact and got it. And it needs to be fairly traceable. So you got to be able to essentially prove that you got it from work. And unfortunately with workers' comp, it's typical that anything that isn't really simple is you're denied. And then you got to go up the appeals process. So for an employee, that gets COVID, most likely they're going to want to discuss the possibility of hiring an attorney. And I know a lot of people have a fear out of doing that with your employer may retaliate. But an employee is protected in the state of Nevada from retaliation. So again, if you believe that you contracted it as a result of your work. So think about those employees that are forced to go down to the Strip. And they're in direct contact with people coming off the plane with no quarantines. And so they're being put, you could argue, directly into harm's way. Is it reasonable? Well, that's your own, I guess, determination of whether it is or it isn't. We need to further business activities. We need to keep the economy going. But what happens if that casino worker contracts COVID? Well, it's probably going to be a hard road to climb to prove that they got it as a result of work as opposed to at the grocery store.
Right. So what are you going to be looking for as an attorney if employees call you from a casino and say, hey, I think I got COVID at work? Well, how do you prove that?
It would be difficult. I mean, you'd have to look at, just like any other case, well, what's the evidence to support that? Were there other employees who had known a positive test of COVID. Were you around those employees? Have you essentially sort of isolated yourself like so many of us out of fear, where other than socially distancing with a mask at a grocery store and some basic necessities, the only time you're really putting yourself at an exposure risk is on the job? A large number of people, people that are potentially sick. Is your employer doing the screening? Things like that. So again, it's on a case-by-case analysis, but it would be hard for those individuals, again, that aren't those frontline workers to prove it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with thousands and thousands of people contracting COVID, is your phone ringing off the hook from employees?
No. We do workers' comp as well as personal injury and wrongful death, but no, I think fortunately, the majority of individuals, as we know, that contract COVID don't end up with a significant illness or protracted hospital stay. However, this is just a guess because our phones have not been ringing off the hook in this regard, is that I think employers have stepped up, even though there are protections in place for them, to try to do the right thing because they need these employees. And they realize that their business can't survive without them being in contact. So unless I think there's an employee really trying to take advantage of, my guesstimate, just based upon past dealings, is that employers are trying to do the right thing.
So Deanna, I have a question. I am running a beauty salon, and 10 of my employees come down with COVID, as well as 5 customers. But I haven't really put any of these safeguards into place. I didn't do a plan. We just came back to work. What would you advise me to do if I called you and said, I have this problem on my hands, and before Brett starts ringing down my door, what can we do? Anything?
Well, the facts as you described them sound to me like that's the majority of their workforce. And I would close that business until we got a handle on things. I would close it to the public, make sure everyone got medical care. All the employees saw their physicians. And as Brett said, not everybody, very small percentage of the people that contract COVID ever are hospitalized. And, much smaller percentage of those folks are ever, hospitalized for an extended stay, put on a ventilator or anything like that. So check in with your physician, get a test. Are you under your facts, they're already positive. So check in with your physician, follow his or her guidance. You have to self-quarantine until you're released by your physician to full duty. And when we get a work crew back together and we've brought in a professional company to deep clean the premises, then we'll reopen.
And I guess if I didn't put a plan into place, then I would be negligent, right? So I would be on the hook if I didn't have workers' comp insurance for any medical bills or anything that arose from customers and employees that had extended stays in the hospital, or really any medical bills, right?
I mean, there's a possibility. Most people, fortunately, do, or most businesses do have workers' comp insurance. But yes, they would then have to prove negligence if they didn't, to hold the employer responsible. But it's almost presumed negligence at that point because of the lack of workers' comp. But I think what's important, whether it's myself or our firm or another firm that does workers' compensation, it's really essentially just getting them the benefits that they would be entitled to through the workers' comp program or through the employer that didn't have it. And there are there's limitations in that system. So again, an employee's ability to hold an employer responsible for their negligence is very rare because of that system that's already in place.
Mm. So if an employee of mine called you and had contracted COVID at the workplace, you said that you help them get the benefits that they can get through workers' comp. How are you then compensated for your fees?
So attorneys that do workers' comp typically are only compensated if there is some kind of an impairment rating. And then with the impairment rating, then there's a monetary amount. So usually, it's hard to know to what extent under COVID there may be a permanent impairment. There's talked about blood clots and potential respiratory damage long term. You don't hear a lot about it in the news. But potentially that could result in a disability rating, and then an attorney can get a percentage of that lump sum payment. But ensuring that they're getting the medical treatment and their lost income, 2/3 of their lost income while they're out, is vitally important while these people try to recover.
Right.
And I think this is a good segue to some legislation that was passed in Nevada under our special session. So under the fact scenario that you expressed, where all the employees came down with COVID and several of the customers, I think Brett can speak to this better than I, but there's a Senate Bill 4 that provides limited immunity from liability. We talked about the employees, but what do the customers do? And there's limited immunity if certain things are done. And I think Brett's more of an expert on that.
There's a conflict, an inherent conflict as a business owner of how you think laws need to protect businesses. As a business owner, you would love as many laws as possible to protect businesses, right? But as a customer ourselves, when we go out and our family, our kids go out into a business, we want to ensure that that business is doing what it needs to do. It's fulfilling its duties. It's meeting its responsibilities. Immunity. Laws in place that hold an employer immune or decrease their liability exposure also take away an incentive, a motivation for that business to try to ensure that it's providing a safe business. And so it's hard when you look at it both ways. So I'll try to look at it from the way of the business owner. If I put my ethics and morals aside and only looked at profit, only looked at revenue, then I would think, okay, I don't want to be held responsible for anything. But we know that just isn't the way the world works, right? If you do something wrong, if you're unreasonable, whether you're driving a car, whether you're a business owner and you chose the wrong surface, and every time it rains, it becomes like glass, and you have that on the steps leading up into your business, and no rails, things like that.
Right.
You're going to be held responsible, right? You're going to be negligent, and you should be responsible, not the government or not the person's own pocketbook, and have to pull their money out of savings just to take care of their medical bills and all that, right? And their time off from work. So, but because of, I think, fear of Las Vegas being a tourist town, people coming to us and businesses being fearful about opening in this pandemic, about the potential for liability, there were a lot of pressure came down on our government, our governor, our legislators. And so there was a special session that was called up in Carson City. Mm-hmm. And that special session, which Deanna had mentioned, SB 4, Senate Bill 4, was pushed forward along, you could argue, partisan lines. And then probably because of different pressures, it became a bit bipartisan, because it was, well, we need to protect our lifeblood, right? The hotels and the casinos. The funny thing is the law went much further than that, and that's important for your listeners. It protects essentially every business with a few exceptions, which I'll mention in just a moment. And what it does is it takes away the right for a customer to sue a business for simple negligence, for acting unreasonably. And I think it's important for people to understand, and correct me, I made some notes here, is that normally, a business owes its customers a duty to keep its premises in a reasonable, safe condition, right? That makes sense. Business owners have a duty to exercise reasonable care for their customers. Again, makes sense. And they must take all reasonable precautions necessary to protect those invitees from dangers. Okay. But COVID created a situation in which the government was convinced that they needed to protect businesses from lawsuits arising from individuals that contracted COVID and then sued them for damages for exposing them to that risk. Mm-hmm. And so now what it requires is that there needs to be gross negligence. That's the standard. Gross negligence, they didn't comply with the standards. Okay, well, where are these standards found? We talked about that a few minutes ago. You got to educate yourself, right? They're out there. There's CDC guidelines. Our governor has mandates. Governor Sisolak.
Can I ask you a quick question on that? Because I go right to that is, what are the right standards to follow? Like, do you have to get the CDC? Do you have to get your state, wherever you're operating? Like, do you got to pull them all together and decipher which ones to go with?
We can split it up. I'll start with the governor's mandates. I mean, the governor says specifically what you have to do, right? So you have to follow those governor mandates. They are requirements.
The short answer to your question is yes. You have to make yourself knowledgeable about everything that's out there. And then you have to take the best guidance, because right now it's too new. It's like Brett said, this is uncharted water. they're just, everything that's being done is being thrown together, just like SB4. And no one these governmental agencies don't want to take any responsibility, and sometimes they don't have enough authority to do what should be done right now. So, and you see that we get no federal guidance. I mean, we have some stuff from OSHA, we have some stuff from EEOC, but it's all issue specific, and you have to find out, what are the issues that are relevant to me and my business, and then learn as much as you can about them. But a good place to start is this roadmap for recovery that the governor put out.
Okay.
And I'm going to give you this, and you can put a link on your website. But it essentially has, these are the mandatory requirements, and then it says these are recommended best practices.
Okay.
And it goes industry by industry. I would start
awesome.
there.
Yes.
I would start there and say, okay, what does the governor think I should be doing?
Right.
Physical distancing, written protocols, mask wearing. That's where I would start. And then the Department of Labor has a prepare your workspace for COVID, big manual that you can read. And I like localized guidance, right? Because we don't really have an overall federal agency the CDC has stuff, the World Health Organization has stuff, but the Southern Nevada Health Department has some nice steps, and it's 3 pages, and it's a good thing to look at just to say, okay, somebody tells you that they're positive. We'll do contact tracing by contacting employees that are determined to have been in close proximity with one another.
Right.
But there's all kinds of guidance out there, and yes, I think responsible business owners need to apprise themselves of what it is. And once you immerse yourself into it, tell me if you agree, Brett, it becomes very repetitive.
Right.
Then you can boil it down to a few things. Wear masks, socially distance, clean your surfaces, have some good protocols for when employees tell you they don't feel well, or they've been tested positive. That's what it all boils down to.
Right.
And that's kind of the point, is that if you do follow basic standards that are out there, basic guidelines that are out there, what you'll find is that you'll be protected under this new law that was passed. Because essentially it's saying that if you make an effort, in fact, it says right here, did you substantially comply with the health standards? If you violated controlling health standards with gross negligence and someone is harmed, then you're held liable. So in other words, you're not following the standards, and with gross negligence, you were deliberate and you were reckless and you disregarded known safety protocols.
That's gross negligence.
That's gross negligence. And that's a huge standard to have to meet, as opposed to ordinary negligence is just a failure to use the level of care and caution that an ordinary person would. And so what they wanted to do was to protect businesses here. But there are a few that are exempt, and that would be hospice, nursing homes, hospitals, places like that where they wanted to ensure that they weren't giving them any sort of a reason, a justification, a motivation to relax their standards. And that they knew, because people have died in these homes and there haven't been proper protocols followed, that they didn't think that they could get the votes to try to pass this through as if they hadn't exempted those particular facilities.
So tell me again the list of exempts. So it's hospitals,
Yep.
nursing homes.
Got it right here, actually. It is a facility for hospice care,
Okay.
a facility for intermediate care, medical care, a facility for skilled nursing, a hospital, or an independent center for emergency medical care. That's essentially it. Everyone else is immune from simple negligence and would be required to have to meet the gross negligence standard.
So, Brett, what do you think about a law like this? For, it's hard because, they're trying to keep businesses going, but for people that do contract at work, or I'm a customer and I come in, how do you feel about a law like this?
It's hard. I mean, I hate the fact that a law takes the decision-making out of individuals, and they don't look at it on a case-by-case basis. So again, if you think about your 8-year-old daughter goes into a business, and the employer had employees there that were coughing, that shouldn't have been there, but yet they had a sign up. Yet they had established written policies and procedures, but there was very little oversight or management. And your 8-year-old daughter who has light asthma contracts COVID. And you read in the newspaper that several people contracted, but there's a law specifically that prevents you from being able to hold them accountable when they were clearly negligent. It's unfortunate that the legislature is not allowing us to look on a case-by-case basis, because there are checks and balances in place. There is a system in place through the courts that can throw out those frivolous cases. Most of the justification for these types of laws, they talk about, well, we want to prevent the frivolous cases. Well, attorneys don't like to take frivolous cases because there's a lot of money, a lot of time in it, and they're violating their own ethical standards, so those cases aren't the ones that get prosecuted. And if they do, they get thrown out by the judge, or you lose in front of the jury because it was a crappy case, right? But let the court decide, let the attorney decide, let the family decide what case should be pushed forward. And unfortunately, with a law like this, you can't do it.
Right. What kind of cases will you be looking for? Like if I called your office and said, I contracted COVID, but I wasn't in the hospital. Like I want to know as a business what kind of cases I should be afraid of.
That's a good question. I think right now, if you're a business and you're not within this exempt list, you don't have to be afraid. Be honest with you. Not from a liability standpoint. I think you should be afraid for your staff, for not exposing your staff, not losing your staff, not hurting, those families that trust and count on you. But from a liability standpoint, I think the standard is so brutal. Businesses can rejoice, again, just looking at it purely from a revenue and a liability standard, that most likely a customer cannot hold them accountable. I mean, you'd have to be really bad to meet that gross negligence standard.
Well, that's good news. We can all get back to work.
Exactly. From a business perspective, it would be good news.
Right.
Yeah.
See, I look at that slightly differently as a defense attorney and somebody that represents businesses as the majority of my work. Because when I read Senate Bill 4, first of all, it's so long and it's so convoluted and complicated. You have to be an expert like Brett to drill down to the summary, the excellent summary he gave you. But when I read it, I was scared to death because I thought, we're still going to, good law firms like Brett don't take unmeritorious cases, but there's a slew of law firms that do. And those are the ones that land on my doorstep.
Right.
And you still have to defend them. And you have to defend them all the way to a jury if it makes it that far. If it's not kicked out on some kind of summary motion. And they're really expensive. And so this doesn't say, I have an iron shield and nobody can harm me as a business unless I'm a hospice or a hospital. It says, provide, as long as you're following the state's directives and the health and safety protocols that have been published, then you'll be provided this immunity. But that's going to be the issue in the case, right? That's going to be the issue of fact in the case that's going to drag it out, and make you defend it for a long time. What protocols applied? Were you compliant with them? Can you prove that you were? What if the employee disagrees? They never told me that I had to wear a mask,
Right.
I think there's some protection here, but it's still, I think businesses are still exposed. I worry about it. I love to hear the way Brett views it because he's a responsible lawyer. I'm not going to take a case that I don't find gross negligence in, like the beauty parlor, the example. They had no protocols. They weren't doing anything. Everyone got sick. He would love that case, but they're not all going to be that obvious.
Well, however, the problem is you don't know most of that unless you're right into litigation, and so you've put the time to file the lawsuit, you've gotten yourself in litigation, you've got experts, you've got time expended into it. To have an attorney that's willing to take that chance when most likely the case is going to get tossed is asking a lot. It's kind of like with the medical malpractice. It's similar, where there are limits in place if you're a resident of Nevada to hold a medical provider responsible, no matter what the harm. And because of that, attorneys that handled those cases dropped like flies. And so it was really hard if you were a victim to be able to find somebody. And I see the same thing happening here. The vagueness of the statute coupled with the gross negligence standard, makes it really hard for a plaintiff to prove that the defendant didn't do enough. But yes, absolutely, Deanna's right. It is incumbent, it is a requirement on the business to educate themselves and put forth these policies, follow those guidelines. That's their best chance. But I think even if they're sort of slack, it's going to be really hard to still hold them responsible. But I hope we have responsible business owners listening to your podcast and do the right thing.
Right. Well, and I'd love to ask, I'm going to put you guys on the spot, so tell me if I'm way off, but because we're distributed on Apple, we do have a lot of listeners in other states. How are other states, do you follow, like, how is California doing? Did they rush through a thing that protects businesses, or?
Great question. I'm not positive about California specifically, but I can tell you as of the last thing I read, it was 12 of the 50 states had passed immunity laws. Now, federally, that's where it gets really scary. Right now, again, looking at it, don't know what side of the aisle any of your listeners are on. I'm sure it's a nice mix like the rest of America. But McConnell and they're pushing forward an immunity bill that would actually preempt, it would trump state law. So that they're trying to actually put forth an immunity that would clear out most viable cases.
Wow.
So it would apply to all 50 states, and it goes much further beyond COVID, because that's how laws work, right? If it can pass through, let's put a bunch of pork in it and see what passes.
Right.
But yeah, there are efforts currently proceeding through the legislature on that issue nationally.
Well, the one thing I've read about California is, it's a very pro-employee state. And so they've already, and several states, and I should have brought this up because I looked at it briefly last night, there are a handful of states, maybe more than that, I'll give it to you for the website, that have augmented their workmen's compensation statutes to provide that if an employee comes down with COVID, there's a presumption that he or she got it at work.
Wow.
So that's really helpful, because I think even from a business owner standpoint, at least I feel like I would rather have every employee that gets COVID have it be covered by workmen's compensation, simply because they would be covered. It's lifetime coverage for that contracted illness, and it's an exclusive remedy. So that kind of solves every problem.
Right.
Now, I'm sure the carriers don't relish that kind of legislation, but I think it would be good. I think it would solve that problem.
Well, it's an interesting argument, right? It's all typically insurance covered. Mm-hmm. So if, as an employer, you're paying for your employee's health coverage, the more the employee uses the health coverage, potentially the more you're going to pay for the health insurance. How many of your your listeners actually pay for the health insurance or pay a percentage of it? So if it's not the health insurance paying, it could be the work comp paying. The important thing is that somebody needs to pay, because if not, then your employee can't get the treatment that they need and can't get back to the job.
Right.
And that's one reason, too, about holding third parties responsible. When you start to make, from an employer's perspective, you start to make others immune, whether it's a doctor, whether it's Target, whatever the business is, then are you going to be left as the employer, paying the way through the health insurance or the workers' comp to get the employee back to work, and also paying them while they're out? So again, immunity for others oftentimes hurts us, and at the same time, it protects us.
Right. Okay, now this is a big question I have. What about, because in my line of work, we have a lot of independent contractors. And think about like all the realtors and insurance agents who are all independent contractors. If they get COVID at work, they're probably not covered under workers' comp because they're not employees.
So again, a little bit of caveat. So I'm the personal injury wrongful death attorney here. We do have workers' comp here. Javier Arguello is amazing. My understanding, without being an expert in workers' comp specifically, is that yes, independent contractors may not be covered, and they're supposed to maintain their own insurance. And so, yes, they could potentially be out of luck. But that's, again, one of the risks you take as an independent contractor. Deanna, do you know otherwise?
Yeah, first I would say that most independent contractors are miscategorized as independent contractors. So that's a a topic for another
point.
podcast.
Right.
But it's a big issue. But yeah, definitely they should carry their own workman's comp. But as Brett just pointed out, it's either the workman's comp insurance that's going to cover for the medical treatment, or it's your own personal health care insurance. So when you're self-employed, you definitely should have a health insurance policy. So you're going to have your medicals taken care of. The only issue is liability. If you're one of those people that got really, really sick and you can demonstrate an inordinate amount of damages, and you require some relief other than just insurance, who pays, independent contractors would have the same problem Brett talked about earlier. Where did I get it? Who was responsible for it? They don't have an employer, so it's going to be one of their customers maybe, or some other place they came in contact with. But just to go back to
Yes.
a quick issue that Brett made me think about. So if an employee cannot prove they contracted COVID on the job, so it's not covered by workman's comp, right? They can't prove they contracted it in the course and scope of employment. So the workman's compensation claim is denied. But their exclusive remedy is workman's compensation against their employer. If the comp claim is denied, there's no way they could sue their employer because of the exclusive remedy.
Correct.
Right?
Unfortunately, they're kind of screwed there, where you have a situation in which the work comp denies the claim. And because they had work comp insurance under the statute, they're protected from a direct lawsuit. And so, yes, then the employee at that time would not have a remedy.
What if the company is sued for one of these things we were talking about? Deanna, can you tell me, typically, does the liability insurance pick up something like this?
I guess it would depend on the kind of coverage. This is a better question for Brett. I don't know if the D&O or premises liability, I don't know.
Yeah.
I would think not, actually, but
Well, I think, correct. Well, it's interesting. So you're saying if workers' comp didn't pick up on it, you're talking about an employer-employee context. If they didn't have workers' comp, you could argue the general liability policy would apply. The problem with that is there's usually an exclusion
There's always an exclusion.
for employee-based claims, so on-the-job claims, because that's supposed to be covered by workers' comp. So now, if someone did not have workers' comp in place, could they find a policy in the state of Nevada that would cover on-the-job injuries? Probably not, because it's required by law. So I think most likely, again, the employee would be out of luck.
What other issues are you guys seeing businesses face during COVID in your practices?
well, a big issue is paid sick leave. And
Paid sick leave, yes.
Yeah, and it's a very complicated issue, and I worry that some employers haven't thought about it, and it's almost something that you have to sit down with on a case-by-case basis and deal with it. But so last legislative session, the Nevada legislature passed a mandatory sick leave law, which requires that every employer with 50 or more employees provide a certain amount of sick leave to pay, and I'm talking about paid sick leave to their employees. So it's a fraction of an hour for every hour worked has to be provided to all employees if you're a covered employer, meaning that you have at least 50 employees. And it works out to be about 5 days paid sick leave for a full-time employee. So employers have to think about that if they have employees that call in sick and they say, I have COVID or COVID-related injury, that they've got 5, if they're full-time employee, they've got at least 5 paid sick days that they're entitled to, because they don't, under the Nevada statute, they don't even have to tell you why they're taking it. They can take it for any reason at all.
And this is for employees with over 50 employees.
Employers with over 50, yeah. And then there's a federal act, it's called the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. The acronym is FFCRA. People are becoming familiar with it. And it's an act that provides paid sick leave, mandatory paid sick leave, and also expands the type of leave you can take under the Family Medical Leave Act and gives partial payment for that too. And it's really an enormous benefit. It only applies to employers with 500 employees or less. So it wouldn't apply to a behemoth employer like MGM Grand would not be covered by this law. They would be covered by the state sick leave law. But if they already had a policy in place where employees got 5 paid days off, they're exempt from that state law requirement. So if this, the federal act applies to any employer with fewer than 500, and then there's one aspect of it, which is the extended leave, that may not apply to smaller employers fewer than 50. So what the federal act requires is that basically employees that fall into 6 different categories are entitled to 2 weeks paid leave. It's 80 hours. So if they have lost child care due to COVID, because COVID shut down the child care facility, if they contracted it themselves, if they have to care for somebody at home that contracted it, there's a list, and I'll provide you with this little cheat sheet for your listeners.
Listeners, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of breaks it down. It's so if employees are subject to a state or federal quarantine order, if they've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, if they're experiencing symptoms and they're seeking medical advice, or if they're caring for an individual, a spouse or a relative, they're entitled to this 2 weeks paid leave. Now, I always say, well, this is if they can't work from home. Because
Right.
if they can work from home and they're, because their child can't go to daycare, well, then work from home.
Right.
But if you're a nurse in an ER and you can't work from home, you're entitled to the two weeks paid leave. Then there's another component of it that provides for expanded partially paid leave if an employee is caring for somebody who actually it's if the school is closed, they're only entitled to partial pay, and they could have up to 10 weeks partial pay under the expanded Family Medical Leave Act. It's I don't see it being used a lot, and I'm afraid that a lot of employers don't know about it. And I'm afraid that when the dust settles, people will come back and file claims saying you denied me this.
And that's the Extended
This
Leave
benefit.
Family Medical Act, and that's a federal?
It's called the Family First Coronavirus Response Act,
easy to say.
FFCRA.
Right.
FFCRA.
And that's for, again, businesses with over 50 employees, or is this for the under 500?
It's for every employer with 500 or fewer employees.
Oh, yes, that's a big one then. That we should definitely check out.
Yep.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, when the swine flu came, I had a controller who actually contracted the swine flu and was on a ventilator for I think almost a month. So 2 weeks, though it doesn't seem like a lot of time, paid time off for people who are really sick.
Although the great thing is that the employer doesn't have to pay for that time off, or at least they can get reimbursed for the cost that the
They
cost
can
of
get
that.
tax credits. Yeah.
Tax
Okay.
credits. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're getting tax credits for the paid leave that
Yes.
you're offering the employees.
Yes.
Interesting.
And right now everybody's trying to pinch some pennies, trying to deal with this. You had asked what else can the businesses do during this time. I think you really need to reassess your business and decide, can the business operate remotely, effectively and efficiently? Do you need to evolve now? Is this going to be sort of the new normal that people have talked about? Even if you can bring people back in the months to follow, should you? You do increase an exposure risk for the people that are essential for your business to operate. But we're probably, I'm sure you have and your listeners have heard more and more of their friends and family saying, well, actually, they're just going to keep me at home, which actually scares the heck out of me. My wife already told me that would not work. I could not stay home and work now.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want to. I just like the buzz here. And there's, as being an attorney too, we have courts. But the courts have operated via Zoom or as Blue Jeans or by phone. But eventually we do need to get back to jury trials. But another thing that they really need to think about is furthering their mission of their business. I mean, it's easy to get off track where you're so worried about, and rightfully so, but you're so worried about COVID and how to make sure your business is safe. Are you still providing your product? Are you still providing your service? Mm-hmm. And so they still need to, well, especially now you're having staffing issues, right? Staff they don't want to come in, or maybe you're having to lay people off and you're having to hire people that are less capable, less experienced. You're trying to find ways to meet these unprecedented times. So what happens is you can get off track. And so you really do, as a business owner, need to think about is, are we providing the same level of service we did before? And if we're not, is it bad enough we're going to start losing customers? So what can we do? So this evolution, we need to change.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in thinking about people, like you said, it's also our duty as business owners to think about people. As in my line of work, which is creative advertising, I find the best work comes out from collaboration and brainstorming and really like throwing stuff up on the wall. And when we do that remotely, we can do it remotely, but I find that the product in my mind isn't as good. And I think too, in regards to, I see these kids going back to school. I mean, my kids' school is back full time. They go 5 days a week in person. They have the best protocol. They have it dialed in. I'm so proud of their school. Yes, you could close the school, but I find that my employees, they also need human interaction. They need a tribe. They need, what we all come together and to collaborate. And I just feel like if we keep them all at home, we're really doing them a disservice. And that's where I think a lot of the rub is right now for us in our industry and with my company is I feel like people need people.
Well, as a personal injury attorney or wrongful death, you're dealing with tragedy most of the time. So they call us counselors. And it's so true. We have to put on that hat. To be there for people, to connect with people, to provide the support that people need. And obviously it translates to other businesses as well.
Yeah.
Doing that remotely is difficult.
Yeah.
Especially for guys. I don't know. I don't like talking on the phone for a very long time, but my wife can sit on the phone for, half an hour.
Right.
And so it's hard when you're dealing with your male clients a lot of times, or your male attorney, to have that type of connection. But yes, having our employees in this building is a tremendous benefit to this business, because picking up the phone, I think you'd be much more likely to stick your head in someone's office.
Right.
So we have to continually think about what's best for my business if I can safely do it.
Right. That is the hard question.
Yeah, now that we've gone on for 8 months now, I think that's what employers are focusing on. How do I get back to my normal? Because we're so disrupted at this point. I'm a partner in a national law firm with 27 offices in 15 states, and everybody has been, and our firm it was our firm's decision to tell everyone to stay home. And certain states were just shut down. Nevada, we were always allowed to come to work, but we wanted everyone to feel safe and everyone to be guided by the same leadership decisions. So we told everyone to stay home. Well, now there is a big segment of the employment base that likes working from home. And it's hard to make an argument as to why they can't do that. I have assistants and paralegals and secretaries that want to work from home.
Right.
And there are a lot of things that you lose when they're not there with you. I mean, you guys are talking about the synergy, and I think Brett and I feel the same way about this. I want my people back. I want my team back. I want I want to be able to walk by and ask somebody to grab a file, and they can't do that when you're home. I'm just going to do it myself. So my productivity level has gone way down.
Yeah.
Can you write a brief when you're home? Yes, you can. Are you there for me to kick around an idea with you? No. Am I going to think about calling you, or am I going to spend the day on the computer myself?
Right.
The whole rhythm of the office is lost, and we want people to come back.
Yes.
And we're finding out that a lot of people, or say 50%, don't want to come back.
Right.
They're like, this worked. Why can't this just go on?
Right.
Well, because I like to stick my head in your office. Well, call me. I'm right here. Put me on a Zoom. Put me on your calendar. And it's just not the same, and it's hard to articulate why it isn't the same.
Right.
So then you decide, well, I own this business. Do I just require them to come back?
Right.
And I want to do that. I don't know. Brett will tell us what his decision has been. I want to do that. But then I have people say, well, I'm scared. I'm scared if we're in a bigger environment, I have a larger chance of contracting COVID. So then that becomes an issue. Is that a good excuse? Do they have the right to stay home if they're afraid to come back? And my answer is no.
They don't have the right to, well, am I allowed to require that they have to come back?
I say yes, you are. And the only time an employer has to make an accommodation for an employee is if they're disabled, as that term is defined under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if someone is disabled, they have, let's say they have asthma, or they have, some sort of respiratory condition, something that would make them extremely vulnerable to COVID, then yes, then that's a good reason to consider you a vulnerable population and make an accommodation for you. But still, I want to see a medical documentation that says you do have that condition and we are going to make an accommodation for you. I would do it in an orderly fashion. I wouldn't let it just be, I'm afraid to come back to work, so, all right, stay home.
So you are allowed to require that medical, certification.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
Yes.
Brett,
Have you
what's your
required
take?
that they come back?
Well, we're at that point because there's some people who just rather stay home. But then we find that the individuals that are here are having to rely upon others to make up for their absence. And that's not fair to them.
Right.
And they're trying to get their work done. And it makes it more difficult, too. Again, different businesses, right? It can apply, doesn't apply evenly across. But there's also the mental and the physical health component is a real strong part of this. I'm going through an injury right now to my ankle, and I'm not running, and I'm a runner. And I've noticed that I needed that so that work wasn't the all-encompassing 100% domination that it is. And obviously there's family and friends and other things, but yeah, I think you know what I mean. You try to find that work-life balance. And so it's as a business owner, it's very important not only to potentially have them here, but maybe away. And so finding that balance for your particular business is now, again, this evolution. We're recognizing we're getting people more stressed. There's a lot of fear, rightly so, a lot of
Right.
insecurity.
Yep.
How many of these listeners won't have all their employees back or won't have any of their employees back? Their businesses may not be open. And so it's scary, but when you do start to bring people back or everybody is back, you need to realize that we're still not in a normal situation.
Right.
So what can the business owners do to have those happy, productive, effective, efficient employees and themselves, the employers themselves, to be able to manage it and oversee it correctly? And that's what we're all trying to figure out, right? And so there's no easy solution, but I think they need to listen to their employees and each other. This collaboration, that's going to allow us to make the right decisions. Because if we think that we've got this all figured out, we don't.
Right.
Unless you've been through a pandemic before.
Right. Which is none of us.
Maybe there's a couple.
Around in 1918.
Right, a couple of 100-year-olds running around.
Right.
But no. So again, we as business leaders, we have to be human beings too.
Right. And that work-life balance, I think working from home, it's never turns off. That's why I think some of us need to get back to the office.
With people working from home and typically not working that 8:30 to 5, but given the flexibility to do their job, just do your job, more and more people are working, late Thursday night, Saturday morning, Sunday, afternoon. And so they don't have those boundaries. And so it's that constant sort of work-life balance that's in complete flux. And so as an employer, you have to realize that you may think you're actually getting an advantage by your employees working remotely. We're kind of assuming that every employer wants them back.
Right.
But if you want them remotely, then you have to understand is long-term what are going to be the effects, not just on the business directly, but indirectly through the effects on the employees.
Right. Well, all good issues and all good issues that we've raised. Any last parting advice, you guys? Anything else?
Just along the lines of what we were just talking about, I think that this disease will change the face of business.
Yes.
Because we're finding out that we don't all have to be in the same office at the same time, right? With lawyers, it's easy. I don't worry about associates working from home because I don't care if they're working Sunday night, or Thursday, morning. As long as the work is done, they know what their deadlines are. They know what their hourly requirements are. They can work from anywhere they want, as far as I'm concerned, for the
Right.
most part. We lose the synergy, but the work is done. And then you think about, your footprint, your office space. Do I need as much office space? What kind of a reaction is that going to have on commercial real estate? Are people going to take, the whole floor when they can probably take volunteers who want to work 3 days a week and take half the floor? I think there are going to be long-term effects on business that will have a domino effect because of the
Agreed.
experience we've had.
Yes, agreed.
And there are silver linings. On a positive, you're right. I do think there's going to be more efficiency. It's less of a carbon footprint. I mean, we would typically fly all across the U.S. and sometimes internationally for depositions, as an example, meeting with experts, witnesses. And there's going to be less of that because the technology has really improved, and we're being forced to use it. And so we're starting to see what works. And could you imagine this pandemic 30 years ago, before that technology? I mean, the whole idea of working remotely with remote connections and online businesses and all this, it just wouldn't have happened, let alone getting your food delivered well, I guess you can get that Chinese food delivered potentially, but nothing like it is now.
Right.
And so there are improvements, and I think as businesses, we have to learn through this and improve through this and not just see this as a negative.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I will include in the show notes emails and phone numbers for both of you. And just thank you very much for your time today.
It's our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening today. And if we brought you any value, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, make sure to connect with us on Facebook. Our Facebook group is Scrappy Entrepreneurs. And on Instagram, the.scrappy.entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Paula Y. Until next week, stay scrappy.